Good afternoon. The small percentage in power, they call the shots and they hold the wealth. We've seen this movie before in our Korean, our Rhodesia, and our Zimbabwe assignments. Throughout this video, I will briefly describe the complexities and proxy wars from outside participants that are unique to Syria. Quagmire, vortex, and black hole are just a few of the words that come to mind in describing the Syrian civil war. By way of background, the Arab Spring in 2011 involved citizens in various countries basically standing up to oppressive regimes in the Middle East. President al-Assad acted very violently against the Syrian people. He seems to have some of the insecurities and poor character traits of someone like Hitler. I don't use that name lightly. Al-Assad does not have the hearts and minds of his people, and so he seeks to control them by fear and intimidation. And worse, in 2013, he punished them with chemical weapons. Further, while he has control of his military, his family belongs to the 12% sect of Islam, so he is forced to rule by fear and intimidation, as the Sunni population is about 75% of the Syrian population. Some additional facts to think about. There's been pronounced international attention since 2011, when al-Assad started being mean to his own people. Drought problems and economic problems, they lay at the base of the conflict, and they came to the head when the ruling family's poor treatment of children that happened to be criticizing the al-Assad regime. More than half the country has been displaced since 2011. Roughly 5.6 million people are refugees outside the country, and about 6 million in Syria have had to find a new home within Syria. As the Rolling Stones would say, this town's in tatters. The estimates vary widely, but there's roughly 350,000 people to 350,000 people dead and 50,000 missing and presumed dead. The numbers are all over the map. Don't really know, don't have a hard number, but that's what various resources provided, numbers in that range. What's the root cause? The evidence is clear that for the countries involved, the rank and file citizens are poor, they're generally living under a dictatorship, and they are often of a different ethnic group and or religious sect than when compared to their immediate neighbors. Religion in Syria is made up of many faiths and sects. Islam is about 87% of the country, 75% Sunni, 12% Shias, which the Alawites are the largest predominant Shia group, and that's the one that al-Assad belongs to. What are the major conflicts? The core conflict are those that are loyal to al-Assad and then those that are not. It's been very fractured, multiple militias, local and foreign fighters, but the fundamental question is should Mr. Assad's government stay in power? Syria's ethnic Kurdish minority, they sought to go ahead and take land, in the absence of strong leadership. They sought to go ahead and take over various parts of the Syrian land. That's brought Turkey into the fold, as Turkey does not like the Kurds within Turkey, and so Turkey doesn't like the Kurds in Syria either. The third conflict involves the Islamic State known as ISIS or ISIL. The fourth and most complex dynamic are all the other countries that are involved. Those that promote or back al-Assad would be Iran and Russia, as well as the Lebanese group Hezbollah. The rebels, as they're known, are generally backed, and that includes some of the Kurds, would be backed by US, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. Doing some research, there's anywhere from 5 to 8 proxy wars, and I tried to pick the mainstream ones. There's Israel versus Iran, with Syria being a common ground, flyover ground, if you will, to where they cross the Syrian airspace, as they do things to one another. There's Turkey, as I mentioned, versus the Kurds. Turkey wasn't really involved until they realized that the Kurds were gaining some progress in reclaiming some land in Syria, and they didn't like that. They felt that gave a bad message to the 20% of Kurds in Turkey under their control, so they wanted to put a stop to the Kurds gaining anything more. There's the US and Turkey, and that's one of the most interesting things because Turkey's been an ally for the longest time. But with the US backing the Kurds or the rebels, and then Turkey not liking the Kurds, that's brought tensions to increase between the US and Turkey. Then you have Russia and the US, because Russia, as we said, backs al-Assad and that regime. Russia needs Syria as a strategic military base. It's the only place that's close in the region, that it would have for its military operations. So Syria is a very important ally. And the U.S. has obviously taken the opposite side. And so it's not U.S. versus Russia per se, it's U.S. backing one group and Russia backing the other group. So it's a proxy war. Then you have the secularist view, and that is it's Russia, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates kind of versus the Islamist composed of Turkey, Iran, and Qatar. And so you have secular versus religion, is what's going to dominate the Syrian landscape. So one of the questions is, from a moral imperative, shouldn't the United Nations do something? After all, that's why it exists, is what the argument seems to go. The other side is the UN can't get involved because its bylaws won't let it, because at one level you could say this is an intra-state conflict with other countries joining in, but it's really, a heart of it is a civil war within Syria. And so that's the UN's card to say we don't want to get involved. And then if the UN wants to get involved, Russia sitting on the Security Council, they veto everything. So they can't. I would be remiss if I said anything other than that the UN is a bloated debating club that has the power and teeth of a paper tiger. The idea that somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 people are dead on the United Nations watch summarizes gross negligence. I say that regardless of what their bylaws say. If they wanted to fix it and they had any effectiveness, they'd get it done. The United States. To date, the United States has directed nearly $7.8 billion towards Syrian-related humanitarianism and assistance. Congress has appropriated billions more to support security and stabilization initiatives. There's been many questions as to why are we involved. Simply put, the easy answer is to stomp out ISIS. Largely coming from the Brookings Institution, we have some pros and cons as to why the U.S. got involved in 2017, which President Trump realized that there was some form of chemical warfare going on, and there was a swift and decisive response from the part of the U.S. with military attacks. The pros for the U.S. getting involved would be the U.S. has demonstrated clear support for an international norm that chemical weapons are just an inappropriate tool, even on the battlegrounds. The United States has demonstrated a willingness to use its powerful military swiftly and mightily, forcing the Russians and Chinese to take notice and to consider the possibility that the U.S. at times can be unpredictable and even lethal when needed. And one could say that the strikes may not change the strategic direction, but it may give the Syrians, Russians, and Iranians pause to avoid using weapons like barrel bombs or cluster bombs. The cons of the U.S. going it alone, if you will, would be the minimal strikes are unlikely to convince the Assad regime to do much more than using chemical weapons. They'll just use something else. One could say that President Trump was too impulsive and didn't fully think this through. And third, the airstrikes, they reflect a disregard for multilateral organizations and approaches, and the international legal basis for doing something on our own remains at best unclear. That would be the con side. So in conclusion, I would submit that the Syrian conflict is exceptionally complex. There's multiple parties in and out of Syria that are involved. It's well beyond an interstate conflict, but at its heart it is an interstate conflict. It's fueled by poor economic conditions, ethnic and religious bigotry. Thank you.